Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us again for these clips on the interview that I conducted on July 14th with the former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William B. Taylor. As we mentioned before, the longish interview that I conducted then is broken up basically into three components. The first component is about a just war and whether U.S. support for the conflict is a just war. The second component is about whether the West is obliged to defend Ukraine in this conflict, and the third is about the role of journalism in conflict. So we'll be tackling the first of these three components today, right now. I hope you enjoy the clip, and if you have questions or comments, I'm always available at billgentile@billgentile.com. That's my email address, billgentile@billgentile.com. No spaces, no caps, no dots, no nothing. Just billgentile@billgentile.com. All right, thanks for your attention, and we'll catch you after this is over. What I've done, Mr. Ambassador, to our audience here, I've broken our discussion today into three sections. The first section will be defining a just war. The second section is going to be, is the West morally obliged to support Ukraine? And the third part of our discussion is going to be about what role should journalism play in a time of war. To begin and to give some context, here's a bit from my memoir. And again, you'll hear a little bit of repetition, perhaps not in this excerpt, but in future. The mountains of northern Nicaragua enjoy a mystique all their own. Nicaraguans refer to them not in the plural, the mountains, but in the singular, la montaña, or the mountain, as if the rugged backbone of the country were a single entity, one special realm apart from, but still within, Nicaragua. Prior to the Sandinista takeover, La Montaña was a place where Somoza's hated National Guard conducted some of its most heartless repression against peasants who collaborated with, or who were suspected of collaborating with, the Sandinista guerrillas. It was a dark place of persecution, torture, and solitary death. Despite the hardship and danger, La Montaña occupies a special niche in Sandinista lore, the legendary tales of any guerrilla group being part of the heart and soul of that movement, and the reason why men and women risked torture and death for that movement. It was to La Montaña that the Sandinista front sent its guerrillas for physical, psychological, and political training. It was in the merciless Montaña that the Sandinista cadres endured a sun that causes blisters on foreheads and noses, cold, damp nights that shake the body till dawn, hunger that disorients and actually hurts, solitude that makes men talk to themselves, and fear that steals their breath away. In La Montaña lurk typhoid, malaria, hepatitis, anthrax, and mountain leprosy, a parasite that embeds itself in human flesh and eats away at it in concentric circles, leaving pain and ugly scar tissue. The low-lying plains at the base of La Montaña is cattle country and home to nasty inches-long pests, worms really, that Nicaraguans call torsalos. They normally thrive under the skin of free-ranging cows, but sometimes take up residence in humans. One of my colleagues had to have them removed by a physician who sliced open his skin to dig them out. I contracted a case of anthrax working in the same region. So I can imagine, Mr. Ambassador, that some of this brings back some memories about your time in Vietnam. From what I read and what I've heard from Vietnam vets is that the terrain in Vietnam was at least equally and perhaps more inhospitable than that of La Montaña, where I hung around in Nicaragua. So let's get right into the first question here. You state that Ukraine's war to defend itself against Russia, and by extension, the United States' effort to support Ukraine, are not morally ambiguous. You've already answered part of this question. Can you elaborate on that a bit further, please?
You bet, Bill. And just as you were reading that first part, I'm sure other people who served in Vietnam, we knew those little things that got into your skin as leeches, and they were there as well. The patrolling through mountains like your montaña is what we did. So we were again the 101st, where Captain Seitz and I were in the 101st, was to the west of a town called Way, And it was in the mountains, and it was exactly as you described. But that's not your question. Your question is on Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has this, what I can only describe as an obsession with Ukraine that has led him to try to dominate it for a decade. Putin has been very clear about his attitude toward Ukraine. He's written it down in a long essay last summer. He's also put it in a speech just before he invaded Ukraine in February this year. He said that Ukraine's not really a country. He said that Ukraine is not sovereign. It only exists as part of Russia, and therefore he sees it as his mission as a great Russian leader to bring Ukraine, a sovereign country. Let's be clear. Ukraine has been an independent sovereign country for 30 years. It was dominated by Russians over centuries. There's no doubt about that. And Ukrainians know that all too well. The Russian czars, the Soviets, and now President Putin, they all want to have control over Ukraine. And the Ukrainians have maintained their nature, their people, their nation over the centuries, and they're very proud of their history, Bill. They're very proud that their history, contrary to what Mr. Putin says, Ukrainian history goes back farther than Russian history. So in the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries, the Christian Slavic civilization began in Kiev, in a civilization called, that we know now as Kievan Rus. And as an example of that civilization, in the center of today's Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, there is a beautiful cathedral, several beautiful cathedrals, many beautiful cathedrals in the capital of Kiev, but one is right smack downtown, and it's St. Sophia's Cathedral, and it was completed by the civilization that we now know as Kievan Rus in 1057. In 1057, this beautiful cathedral was completed. It took 20 years to build. In 1057, Bill, Moscow was a forest. Moscow didn't exist. It didn't show up in any document, any historical mention for another 100 years, another century before Moscow even is heard of, this little village on the river. And well before that, Kievan Rus in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, was this civilization. So, and the Ukrainians are proud of that. They're proud of their history. They're proud of their culture. They're proud of their language. They're proud of their literature, their heroes. They've got their own heroes, very distinct from the Russians. And so when they finally got their independence, when the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, and Ukraine voted to leave the Soviet Union, and they put it to a vote in every part of Ukraine, and every part of Ukraine voted to leave the Soviet Union as Ukraine, as an independent country, as a sovereign nation. And that was 30 years ago. And they're very proud to be free now of Russian domination, of Soviet domination, of Soviet empire domination. They're very proud to be, and they're fighting for it, because that's what Putin wants to take away. Putin wants to take away their independence, their sovereignty, their freedom. We say these words, and you make this point a couple of times, Bill, in your book, that some of these words, freedom, independence, democracy, we almost take them for granted, or we don't really know what we're saying when we use these as justifications for wars that we get involved in one way or the other. And you make this point very well. The Ukrainians know what freedom means. The Ukrainians know what independence means. The Ukrainians know what sovereignty means, what it means to be a sovereign nation. And they are willing to fight and sadly die to keep that. So this is why I say it's morally clear where the Russians are and where the Ukrainians are.
It's really surprising, and I think even the Russians will agree to this, that how ferociously the Ukrainians have defended their country, how hard they fought against the invasion. So thank you for that, Mr. Ambassador. Let's go on. Another question I have, and there's a little bit of background here, so it's a longish question. Is the conflict's image as a just war tarnished at all by some of the folks fighting in it? And I'm referring here to the Azov Battalion, the far-right militia based in the Donbass region that was created in May 2014 to resist Russian aggression in eastern Ukraine, and which actually figured prominently in the heroic resistance mounted over several weeks in the Mariupol steel plant. Some of the battalion's fighters have openly described themselves as neo-Nazis, and at least one of the group's logos bears an uncomfortable resemblance to the swastika. Russian President Putin has used the Azov Battalion's presence in the region to try to justify his invasion as a so-called denazification endeavor. From a distance, it seems like the sketchy ideological leanings of some Azov militia fighters got a bit of a pass by Western media, especially in the early weeks of the conflict. Critics say that this is because that kind of coverage wouldn't really fit the good versus evil narrative that has characterized a lot of Western media coverage. What do you make of this?
So the Azov Battalion, that as you just described, and you remind us that battalion fought, and we have to say heroically, in Mariupol. Yeah, defended that city first of all, and then that steel plant. Long after they were surrounded, cut off from supplies, cut off from reinforcements, cut off from food, cut off from electricity, cut off from water. And in that steel plant, in the bowels, in the basements, in the caverns below that steel plant, were a lot of civilians as well. And so the Azov Battalion and others, there were Ukrainian Marines who were there as well, who were fighting the Russians who were trying to take over Mariupol. We do have to put in context the Azov Battalion, because no one denies that there were elements earlier on of far-right political leaning people in the Azov Battalion. It probably, as I talked to several of the leaders, some having been talked to several of the leaders, and I know to whom they reported while the time I was there, that is the Minister of Interior. And I had conversations with the Minister of Interior about this, about exactly this is before the invasion, before the war started. And he knew the history. Ukrainians know the history. Ukrainians know that a small portion of the Azov Battalion are far right. Ukrainians know that there's a small portion of Ukrainian voters who vote for far right parties. I will point out, Bill, that proportion of Ukrainians who vote for far right political parties in elections is about 2%. It's about 2%. In other European nations that we know well, that percentage of voters that going for far right parties is much higher than 2 or 3%. I don't know what percent of far right voters in this country that might even be into the neo-Nazi category. All to say that there have been these allegations, and these battalions, these units made up of a wide range of Ukrainians, performed heroically. Last thing I will say about this is, as you point out, the cynical use of this, again, small portion of the fighters by President Putin. And he says his whole justification for this unprovoked attack were Nazis in Kiev, and Ukraine has a Jewish president. So it's laughable. No one takes that seriously. This whole business about denazification, is a fantasy of President Putin. He had to find something to say to justify this invasion, to justify killing tens of thousands of Russian soldiers, not to mention tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians and tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers. He needed some justification. He couldn't find it. There is no justification. So he comes up with these fantasies that he's going to denazify this country that's led by a Jewish president. So all to say that, there is that, and like any big diverse country, we all have our range.
Thank you for that, Ambassador. I take your point about the percentage of far right voters in any country. My older brother, who I think is watching at this time, Lou, has been in law enforcement all of his life. 17 years as a Pennsylvania state trooper. He's always been aware of how dangerous the far right can be, and he used to laugh at the notion that the left was going to try to take over the country, and he said that's not where the problem is. The problem is on the far right, and I'll bet you we've got a hell of a lot more than 2% of voters in this country who will vote for far right candidates tomorrow or today. So your point is very well taken. Okay, that's it for today. We'll be back soon with with another segment or another clip from the interview, from the July 14th interview. I hope you enjoyed this one. I look forward to seeing you again. Take care.